Shall we start? Oh, great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, and welcome to the panel called Is This Panel Good Enough for IEEE VIS? I'm excited because I know that everybody here is like the hardcore quality audience. Like, you're here because you really want to be here. The best attendees are here. Before we jump into the panel, I'm going to do a little public service announcement. The bathrooms are straight out down the hall on the right. Not really. They are, but that's not the public service announcement. 60 seconds. Since we're all in this room and a lot of us are studying visualization or visual analytics, probably some of us for a long time, somebody may have asked you this question: what visualization resources are available to me? Right? A student might ask you that, a colleague, another visualization person, developer, some researcher from some other field. They want to know what visualization resources are available to them. Anybody ever get that question before? I got that question a lot. So there's a paper now that answers this question. It's called Visualization Resources, a Survey. It's for students, teachers, researchers, and developers, and it covers resources on literature, visualization websites, software, special category of color resources, geospatial resources, and visualization blogs. So if anybody's interested, check that out. You can just Google visualization resources, a survey, and it should come up. But there's a link to it from my webpage if anybody's interested. So that's the end of the public service announcement. So what happens, this is a summary of what happens every year at the VIS conference, right? We develop software or we run some experiment, we write a paper, we submit the paper, we get the reviews back, and then we are unhappy, well, 75% of the time we're very unhappy, and then we repeat that process every year, basically. That's a little summary. I don't really have to go into too much detail about that. And so the goal of this panel is just to talk about this process. For example, can we measure the contribution threshold that's required to have a paper or something similar accepted to the IEEE VIS conference? Can the review process be improved, for example? It's difficult to find reviewers. Is there agreement on what constitutes an acceptable contribution for VIS? Can we measure noise in the review process? How does the VIS review process compare to other venues? And can the review load be more efficient or reduced? These are just some of the topics that are open for discussion. Anything is open for discussion, really. But this is the idea. So the logistics, we have a set of very high quality panelists here. And they're all going to have 10 minutes to present their individual perspectives on these topics. We have a mixture of virtual and physical in-person presenters, and they're going to follow the order of surname in alphabetical order. And so they'll each present for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have the discussion with the audience, and then we'll have an optional conclusion statements. Depending on how things go. Okay, great. So I'll hand the microphone over to Cody Dunne, who's the first panelist.
So I'm here to talk to you about how we can incentivize open science as part of the review process at IEEE VIS. Now, this talk has supplemental material. There's a link there up in the top, and it'll hang out down in the bottom left of the slide while I'm presenting. There's a little bit of data and a little bit of analysis code for that data that generated 2 charts in here. But you can also go take a look at that if you wanted to get a sense of what it's like to share materials using OSF. Now I'm going to start with a little tongue-in-cheek activity here. I imagine most of you in the room, especially on Friday, are familiar with the visual information seeking mantra, aka Schneiderman's mantra. Overview first, zoom and filter, and details on demand. But how many of you are familiar with the original context that quote appeared in? This 1996 paper, where it was only one of 10 duplicate lines where each represented a project in which Ben found himself rediscovering this principle and therefore wrote down it in this tongue-in-cheek paper as a reminder. Let's think about what a VIS open practices mantra could be. How about make research processes and results open, where each line represents one project or one paper review, where you found yourself blocked by missing supplemental materials. Now, in my case, there's many, many more examples I can think of rapidly than just the 10 I have here. This is like 10 for the last couple of weeks. And instead of picking on anyone in particular, I'm going to pick on myself. Let's dive into a paper I published back in 2013 on a visualization technique called motif simplification. In this paper, I was presenting this technique that took repeating motifs or subgraphs, subnetworks, and replaced them with representative glyphs to try to get less stuff on the screen. As part of that, I did some algorithms and provide descriptions of those algorithms in the paper. And because it was a Chi PDF, because there was a page limit, there wasn't enough room for the pseudocode, so of course that got moved into a PDF supplemental material. And of course the source code doesn't fit in the paper, but I put it on this delightful site named Codeplex where all this open source code could be shared. Now, coming back 9 years later, how much of this has survived? I went to the ACM Digital Library to try to find my supplemental material, and it wasn't there. I don't know if I made a mistake or if ACM dropped it or whatnot. I know IEEE doesn't guarantee that it'll keep this stuff around forever, but I haven't heard of cases when these things have disappeared. So it could have just been my fault originally not uploading it. The other link, though, to Codeplex doesn't work at all. This is just gone. Microsoft decided to shut down Codeplex about the time they picked up GitHub. And so this repository that I hoped would last for the life of the paper, for as long as people could care about it, is not available anymore. If I dig into the rest of the paper, it turns out there's a lot of crucial details that are unavailable for anyone who wants to try to recreate this work, anyone who wants to try to extend it or test it. The code for the technique is gone now, with Codeplex not being around. The pseudocode you can still find on a tech report on the University of Maryland's website, but I don't know how long that's going to survive. The data for the case studies in the paper, one of them was originally provided, that link's broken. This was 2013, so of course I didn't pre-register my study, but I would go and do that if I was going to do it now. What else do I need for the study to be able to reproduce it? Some stimuli would help. I put examples in the paper, but not the actual stimuli themselves, and definitely not the data for generating them. I did have raw data from the study, but I didn't actually convey it in any way except in the aggregate statistical results. And I didn't share the analysis code either. So there's a lot of stuff here, a lot of degrees of freedom that are completely lost to anyone reading this paper. I didn't even present all the analysis results. I only reported the significant findings. So potentially there's some null findings there that would have also been interesting for people to explore and look at. Now, this isn't just gone. I do have a filing cabinet. The stuff is around somewhere on a computer or on paper. But let's just do a quick check here for the bus factor of this data. How many people have to disappear for this data to be gone? That's one. It's just me, and I bike. So it's not a great situation to be in here for this data that hopefully somebody would find useful down the road. I can do better. I could use a reliable open long-term archive with persistent identifiers. It's something that's like keep on updating it if I notice stuff missing or stuff that's incorrect. For example, OSF, like the supplement for this talk. I can just upload all my files there. And I should just put everything I possibly can for people to reproduce my work, for them to understand what I did, for them to scrutinize what I did. And I should make sure that I make myself and make my students do this at submission time. We're not going to get around to this later down the road. We don't have that deadline pressure forcing us to do it. And what's more, peer reviewers need this information in order to evaluate your findings in some cases, in order to determine what statistics you've run, or to actually try it out for themselves and determine whether they trust your results, whether they find it credible. Now this was 2013. This was a long time ago. What's happened lately? Well, if you were at the town hall, you saw this chart, right? And between 2017 and 2019, open access of papers has improved a lot in VIS. We're up to now about half of the papers being posted as preprints on reliable open archives like OSF and Archive. But data isn't doing very well. Most of the stuff that we publish doesn't have data available, especially on reliable open archives. Now, this chart paints a pretty nasty picture. I'd just like to caveat that these are underestimates. It is hard to capture all of this information about what information is stored where. Steve Haraz and other folks who have contributed to IEEE VIS, where this data is from, have done an amazing job, but there's some mistakes there still. But it seems like there's some work we can do here. At the town hall, we talked about some long-term open science goals for VIS. First, we thought that research should be accessible to everyone. Second, our research should be transparent, scrutinizable, and trustworthy. And third, it should be replicable or transferable. If you follow that link in the bottom right, which is available on the slides online, you can see more detailed descriptions of what we're thinking about. Now, to reach these goals, we have to have some sort of incentives. There are ways we can incentivize authors to do open science, to share all of this stuff. And I'm going to call in my lovely assistants here. We have the carrot assistant and the stick assistant. The carrot approach, we can do recognition. We can say, hey, great job. This is an academic contribution. These open science contributions matter. We're going to take them into account when we hire people. We're going to take them into account when we promote people. That would be fantastic. One way we can do this is with badges. For example, saying, hey, you did a good job releasing your open data, you get the blue badge. You did a good job pre-registering your study, you get the red badge. You know, ACM, especially conferences like Sigma, have done a great job actually building committees that evaluate the reproducibility of submissions to the conference. And ACM has done a delightful job of putting these badges directly in the PDF itself that you can download from the digital library. The Replicability Stamp Initiative and TBCG are making progress on this front as well. We just don't have the beautiful little icons in the papers themselves. So that's the carrot approach. The stick approach is to incorporate a lot more of this into the basic peer review. Talking about guidelines or requirements. Actually have the peer reviewers go and check the supplemental materials and make sure that everything they need in order to properly evaluate the work, or for someone to actually take this and use it later on, is included. Now this adds reviewer burden, and that's why I'm talking about it right here in this panel here. But it doesn't have to add a lot, especially initially. There's some basic checks you can do in just 10 minutes to get a sense of whether everything is plausible. And you only need to dive into the details if something is a red flag or something is confusing. Now, this would be a big change for VIS. So what we're thinking of doing for VIS 2023 is baby steps. We're going to encourage people to submit and review supplemental materials, but it's still entirely optional. That we're going to be providing recommendations to assist people in submitting their materials effectively and in reviewing submissions. And we're going to change the BGTC format to allow supplemental materials and a couple other sections on the references only page there at the end, so that it doesn't count for the main body of the paper. Hopefully that'll encourage people to write a little bit more about where their stuff is and how to find it, as well as crediting where things came from. Now, This process is going to be a change for VIS, and we want to get your input. How can we incentivize open science as a conference? How do you think we should continue this process through VIS 2024 and 2025? Lonnie Bessenzon and I have put together this survey where we're asking what kinds of supplemental material are valuable for your kind of work, and whether you have any concerns about this process or any thoughts you want integrated. So we'd please appreciate any input you guys have. Thank you for your attention.
Next we have Alex in person.
Okay, I picked the title, Everything That's Wrong with Papers at Viz, and some things that are okay, maybe a slight overstatement. But my point here is kind of like summarized in a blog post I wrote about a year ago as I was just coming off a tour of duty as an area papers chair. Some of the things that I saw there, some of the things that I personally have been thinking about. So what I will be talking about today is first critiquing. This comes from personal experience, as you will soon see. Then is the review process broken? Then I'll talk a little bit about ethics in Viz, and then ask the question, do we need a different submission model? Okay, so are we too nice as a community, right? Some of you might be thinking, oh, yes, we know, we pride ourselves on our niceness. You know, I was a young PhD student in 2011, where I got a best paper award, was really excited about that. And it turns out some people are not actually that nice, right? So here is a blog post that I'm quoting a piece of it, I'm keeping it anonymous here, but a fairly famous author, let's say an academic, but a fairly famous blog author wrote, why did no one recognize the dysfunctionality of the end results and warn them before all of this effort was, I won't say wasted, right? So this was like a very, we had a best paper and then we got this blog post and we were pretty frustrated. So, well, we also tried to engage with this person, but it wasn't a fruitful discussion, right? And I never felt like the critique here was super warranted. And more recently, there's this tweet. I'm again keeping it anonymous, but this paper's insistence on what is misleading is disappointing. It exemplifies where empirical visualization research is a waste of time. People ignore the scientific literature and use unsubstantiated heuristics, even in academic publications. Visualization is just pseudoscience, right? That was kind of lobbed at a paper without, definitely without properly engaging with the authors. And so I think that's kind of wrong, right? Like we shouldn't do that, but we also need a forum to critique. We need to critique publications after peer review. The peer review process is noisy, it's not perfect, there's always something to say about certain papers. Mistakes happen, and if you engage with authors and papers in good faith, I think this is actually can be very productive. But what can we do about this? Well, we want factual criticism without personal attacks, right? We want to have something like a review and editorial process for critiques, right? So that when you write up a critique, it also gets a little bit of scrutiny. There's somebody else double checking that this is kind of sensible, right? And we don't have anything like that in our community, or at least I'm not aware of it, right? Like where would I put a critique of a paper that is in good faith? That just doesn't exist. Other fields have that. They have letters to the editors, right? Like I once had, I published a short paper in Nature Methods a couple of years ago, and then somebody wrote a letter to the editor. And eventually the editor got back to us, showed us this critique and gave us an opportunity to respond, and then they published both of those things at the same time. That's kind of the process that we don't have and that we need. So maybe TPCG wants to start a section on letters to the editor where we can do something like this. Maybe the IEEE VIS conference can host a blog where we have a chair that kind of manages something like this, right? There's also the option of doing public reviews and also public post-publication reviews, right? So if we kind of, as a community, choose to move into this more open science approach where all of our reviews are available, why wouldn't we let people put on additional reviews after the paper has been published, right? So these are just some of the ideas. So I want to move on to the second topic. Is the review process broken? Well, I'm going to say maybe here. I'm actually going to talk a little bit about something else because I know that Torston will be talking about this. But just some personal opinions. We definitely should publish reviews and versions of manuscripts. Like, this is really important for transparency, it's important for accountability, and it probably also results in better quality research. There's this movement also that authors should kind of like sign their reviews. But I actually disagree with this because it just makes it much easier for us to all be honest with each other if we can do proper reviews anonymously. And there's no potential for retaliation and conflict if you have this anonymously, right? So we can manage this without disclosing anonymity, identities. And just yesterday I saw this post by eLife that is all about reviewing without accepting papers, right? I don't think we as a community are ready to move to something this radical, right? But it's a pretty intriguing idea. So what eLife will be doing from now on is they will be publishing every single paper they review with an assessment and with the reviews. So when it gets reviewed, it will be available on their page, right? There's no accept or reject decision anymore. That's kind of weird, right? And something for us maybe to think about. Why will it work? I think it might work. It's kind of like, interesting. If you, for example, get a bad critique, you might be incentivized, or you will be incentivized to update your paper and then get a better assessment. So the other thing that I am amazed that we're not doing is double-blind reviewing, right? So this is like the oddest thing ever. We must do double-blind reviewing, right? It's imperative for equity and for fairness. If you look at doubleblind.org, guess how many CS conferences currently do double-blind reviewing? 44. Guess how many don't? 5. And we are at a conference that thinks of themselves as like human factors, like as being thinking about the people. And I don't understand it, right? Why hasn't this happened 10 years ago? We absolutely need to do this. So I don't think there are any excuses. There's plenty of evidence that double-blind reviewing significantly improves equity and fairness. So some of you might now be having some questions, like, but what about conflicts? Like, how do we manage conflicts? And I think conflicts, for example, aren't really a reason to not do this. External reviewers already often don't know author's identity because they choose optionally double-blind. PC members know, I can't really manage conflict just by knowing somebody's identity, right? I don't know every author on a paper, all of their friends, and all of their former advisors. So that just doesn't help. So what we need is either technical solutions in PCS, but also, is it really that bad that somebody, a friend reviews a paper without noticing, right? I don't think that's a big problem. And so the big theme of all of these questions here is, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? Like, we have something we need to do, and then we figure out everything else. What about open science? That's the next question that people usually ask. Well, obviously, that is something we have to think about, but I think it's actually another case of don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So, for example, we can ask authors to not actively promote papers while under review, and we can ask reviewers to not attempt to de-anonymize authors, right? Just don't Google the title. That is okay. And I would also argue that we should not be prohibiting posting preprints because we want to enable open science, right? So I think we can manage this, and we can have a little bit of faith in our reviewers and in our authors. But I can tell who it is anyways, right? That's the other argument that I always hear when I talk about this. Well, actually, you can't. It's not that easy. Like, I test myself sometimes, and most of the time I can't. Of course, if it's like a Vega paper, I might be able to guess which group it is, but in many other situations, you actually cannot tell. Again, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. But it's extra work for the authors. Well, yes, it is a bit, but also we make tons of different versions of videos nowadays, and we write blog posts and tweets and so on, and just doing a little bit of anonymization is probably worth the effort. So equity here is worth the effort. But I can't anonymize my code and my system, and I want to submit all of these as well. Well, you can. It's a little bit of work. You should, for example, submit code as a zip file instead of a GitHub link, right? That is a solution. There's also a technical anonymization solution where you can essentially link a GitHub repository, right, and then we'll give you an anonymous version of it. Or we as a conference could take a responsibility in this. We could, for example, provide a repository for people to host tools. So there's many different solutions. I don't have the perfect answer for all of these, but my point here is equity is worth the effort. The other argument that you could maybe say, but journalists don't do it. Well, that isn't actually a very good argument. They should. Like, I don't get why journalists don't do it, right? Like, why does TVCG not have an anonymous review process, like a double-blind review process? I don't get it. So, if you have an answer to that, I would like to hear it. So, and I want to make the case here for real double-blindness. I don't think we shouldn't do something half-baked, right? So, right now, the way this works is even if a paper is submitted double-blind, the primary and the secondary know the identity of the authors. And those are the people who make decisions, so they are actually way more powerful than the external reviewers. I don't get why the primary or the secondary need to know the identity. Maybe not even the paper chairs need to know the identity, right? So we have this model with area paper chairs. I, as an area paper chair, I've never been in a situation where I need to contact an author, right? So there's like overall paper chairs that could know all of this information, but there's not really a reason for anybody else to know the identity of the authors. Okay, I want to briefly move on to some other topic that I was extremely surprised about. Ethics in VIS are optional. So ethics violations or potential societal harms are not a reason to reject a paper at VIS. You can't rely on institutional watchdogs. IRBs are narrow and not everybody has them. So like that's kind of like the problem. So what I think is we need something like a required ethics section in paper. For example, authors should discuss ethical issues with human participants, potential harm for individuals, potential for societal harm. And Casey Fisher made this very good case, right? Here is a list of questions that you should be discussing in your paper. Is there any unintended consequences for individual, communities, for science, for society due to bad actors? And other conferences do have this. There's the New York's broader impact statement. In the interest of time, I'm gonna leave it out there. But you know, this has been done before. And at VIS, you cannot reject a paper for ethics violations. Another thing that comes up is submission cycles. Do we need more deadlines? No deadlines. Something else. A CCW-like model with multiple submission times, continuous submissions. Well, here I don't really have a strong opinion, but I do think we have a lot of conferences already, right? And they're all pretty good. We have VIS, EuroVIS, Pi, and the TVCG option. So for me, it doesn't seem worth the administrative overhead of going to some complicated reviewing model where I can submit any time. So maybe, you know, I would rather work on some of these other issues. So this is what I was covering today: critiquing, reviewing, ethics, and submission, and I'm happy to discuss this later.
So next we'll have a virtual presenter, Torston Moeller.
You're muted.
Hey Torston, I don't know if you can hear me, but we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Ah, yes, we can. Thank goodness.
Sorry. All right. First of all, before I say anything else, I want to point out that reviewing is hard. It's really, really hard if you want to do it well, and we should acknowledge that. It takes time. It really takes a lot of time. There's lots of aspects to consider, from novelty to rigor to writing and all that fun stuff. And it does require a good overview of the existing literature, oftentimes in different areas. Oftentimes you kind of have to look up related work while you're reviewing. It's just a lot of work. However, there is relatively little feedback for reviewers. Getting feedback as a reviewer is also difficult because everything is confidential. And there's no real training or community efforts. There are some exceptions, actually. And I think that's something to consider. And in the end, there's really no incentives. After all, it's really work. And so if you want to improve, if you want to get feedback as a reviewer, there's really little to to go on other than just learning on the job and see what the other people said to that paper. Some actually tried niceness scores. Here's what we did in 2009, and some people repeated that at a later point, where niceness gives you at least some sense of how are your reviewing efforts or scores are doing compared to the other reviewers over multiple papers. So positive here is you're a nice reviewer, you give more than the average, and negative is sort of you're tough. And this at least gives you a compass where you're at. Still, it is hard. Even with experience, many years of experience, they're really tough calls to make. Should we publish negative or null results? Is this paper actually, and that's a bit where the title is coming from, is it good enough for IEEE VIS, but perhaps not good enough for IEEE CDA? But some of the other panelists have a bit more to say about that. So my point is, reviewing is hard and there's tough calls to make. However, reviewing, therefore, it's not a surprise, it's actually rather noisy. But the question is, how noisy is it after all? And here I kind of want to draw your attention to a really, really nice experiment that the neurons community did in 2014. They actually repeated it just last year. But here I'm just focusing on some of their results and the analysis that they did for the 2014 experiment. In a paper, he used a reference that was published last year with a very nice retrospective perspective. So what did they do? 10% of all submissions, in this case it was actually 170 papers, were reviewed by 2 independent committees. The result here is there. It was really, really surprising even for people that 50%, truly 50% of the papers that were accepted in one of the committee were rejected in the other. And here I quote the paper, the committees acted better than random, but not by a very large margin. And that really came to a surprise to a lot of people. Now, the paper that I'm citing actually goes into a lot of details and does a lot of really interesting analysis. And they explain the inconsistency actually based on the subjectivity of the reviewers' scores and an objective part of the reviewer scores. And based on the statistical analysis, they ran a simulation experiment that showed that the consistency of the decision would improve with the number of reviews. And here's a figure out. Of course, the drawback is that with tax, reviewing on the whole system even more. But I think it's an interesting and relevant analysis. But the paper also points out that consistency would actually be nice, but more important is, has the right decision been made? And that's a totally different point of view, or a totally different question to be asked. And here is something really interesting what they did. After 7 years, so the experiment was in 2014, the analysis was done here that I'm showing you 7 years later in 2021. And they compared, they took the number of citations of the accepted paper of 2014 in 2021 as a proxy for impact. And so they drew on the x-axis the average score of the paper from 2014, the average impact assessment of the reviewers in 2014, as well as the average confidence that the reviewers cited for that paper in 2014. Relatively, on the y-axis is always the number of citations, here in the log. And you see, in my humble opinion, there's not a whole lot of correlation. And in fact, the highest numerical correlation is with the reviewer confidence. The confidence that the reviewer gave for reviewing that paper. Now, they went even further. They actually looked at all the rejected papers and what happened to those rejected papers. And a whole bunch of them were actually later published in lots of different venues. And if you look into this particular graph, and if you actually estimate the papers that were published in 2014 or that were accepted in Europe in 2014 and the other papers that eventually got published in one particular place, we actually get an acceptance rate of roughly What they also have done here is they looked at the number of citations of those rejected papers. And what is interesting to note here is that green are the papers that were eventually accepted somewhere. Blue are the papers that ended up in archive or a similar preprint server. And a dot is a paper that was accepted at Murex, and a cross is a paper that got rejected at Murex. And here this figure is worthwhile to come back and take some time to understand. And here I'm quoting the paper, the most highly cited rejected paper has more citations than all but 2 of the accepted papers. Now you can say that maybe it's an outlier after all. But if you look at the figure, it's not so much of an outlier. And some of the conclusions that the paper drew was as the size of the community has grown and we are all becoming more familiar with each other's individual research contributions, there is the danger that the number of publications that top-tier conferences are becoming a proxy to represent the quality of an individual researcher. For early career researchers who have had less time to establish themselves, this proxy measure will be highly sensitive to inconsistency in the reviewing process. So, coming back to ethics, I'd argue that could be argued to be an ethical problem. Is the review process fair? Arguably not. Is the process transparent? No, by definition. So one could argue that violates the FAT, the fair, accountable, and transparent principles. Does the process do harm? Arguably less, especially for early career researchers. And along those lines, it would also violate the Georgetown Doctrine. Now, what do I suggest to do? There's 4 things that I think are really worthwhile to discuss. A, bump up the accept rate. B, better analysis of our reviewing process. C, repeat the Murex experiment at IEEE VIS. And D, brainstorm ways to address the expected shortcomings as a community. The accept rate has been rather stable over years, always been around 25%, maybe a little less. And this needs a little bit about why exactly that 25%. And here I would encourage us to think about whether a more thorough shepherding process would actually improve us as a community, after all, than having the authors getting rejected and try again, and getting rejected and try again, and then in the end get the best short paper award, as was exemplified by some people at the conference. But other analysts also have some good quality arguments along those lines. We should analyze the reviewing process. However, all this information is confidential. There is, however, a community that can sort of do this, the Visualization Area Curation Committee. Please send your thoughts on what to evaluate and how to do it to its incoming chair, David, or a part of the committee as well. Please also send an email if you want. I would argue to repeat the Murex experiment eventually. Ignorance is bliss, of course, but after all, I think insight into a career-determining phenomenon is really important for us as a community. And only when we know we can act. However, it's a lot of work to do. I think based on the analysis that we have done before, we should brainstorm ways to address the shortcomings. I do think that should be data-driven. I do think it should be participatory, especially including early career researchers. And I'd also argue that one approach would be to bring the communities together and to sort of sub the reject version and perhaps accept major revision, and a new thing that says that this paper would be better suited at one of the other venues to the knowledge. And I think we should review, we should discuss reviewer training. There's lots of things I didn't get to talk to. I'm probably out of time, so I'm going to skip this. But I do encourage you to check out some of the links here. Feel free to send me email or suggestions. Check out the ACC And check out the home for this panel, where we also plan to publish the PDF slides. Thank you.
Next up, we have Alvitta, and she'll be presenting in person.
Maybe we
Say it again. Oh, thank you very much, Torston. And next up, we have Alvitta, who will be presenting in person.
So I'm going to be talking about why we don't see null results at VIS and why I think it's your fault in lots of different contexts. So what are null results? So those of us who conduct empirical studies, you start out with some hypothesis. Sometimes you register it, but for the most part, these hypotheses are based on what we believe in the community. We don't really like just put that number, but we usually decide on hypotheses either based on prior work in our community or prior work in related communities. And so what a null finding is when your results don't support these hypotheses. And to give you an example of this, about a decade ago, or a little over a decade ago, I had this study that I ran, and we had hypotheses that if you show someone text only, they're going to perform worse than if you show them text plus viz, because of course visualization is going to make it easier, right? And no, we didn't see that. And so I thought I did something wrong. I thought this can't be right. And also especially because there was some prior work in the medical community, the psychology community, that suggested that this would work. One of the main differences here is that when we ran the study, we used mechanical Turkus, but when we, on the previous studies, they used like psych 101 students and stuff like that. And so I got the great advice from my advisor, we should probably not publish this, maybe write a tech report. But no one should see this because we did something wrong. Later that year, John Danielle and Moeller, they were doing pretty much a very similar experiment, and they found the same null results. They looked at 6 different types of visualization, and they found no difference between text only and text plus viz. And so one of the things that they did, though, that was really good, they didn't just publish this null result, they did that obligatory follow-up study that say, if you squint or if you turn your head a little bit away, like visualization can work under some very specific situations. And so that is one tactic that people do for publishing the null results. But but this paper was very inspirational for me because I'm like, well, I'm told you were wrong. But it really showed me that I can publish null results. So this was very influential for me at a very, very early stage in my career. Why am I talking about this? Well, because null results are very common, but we just don't hear about it. They're very unlikely to be published as opposed to positive results. We saw, like Cody mentioned earlier, that even in a paper that he published, he only talked about the positive results, and he just excluded all the null results. There was a really cool paper that was published in Science back in 2014, where they really look at trying to understand why people don't publish null results. And just to give a little background, this came from an NSF program called TESS. What you need to know about this program is that they had a 2-stage review, where people submitted ideas for specific studies that they want to run. And so people, you had reviews of these studies, and then they were able to do follow-ups with their authors later on to see how many of these studies were actually submitted in the end, and how many of these studies were just never submitted. And so it turns out that, so this is the bar chart that compares the strong results, the mixed results, and the null results. So the dark burgundy shows the ones that were never written up at all. And the yellowish shows the ones that were either published in top journals or non-top journals. But the strongest takeaway from here that you see here is that a vast majority of the null results were just never written up. And so authors just decided, okay, this is not worth publishing. They did an overview of why authors didn't publish. So some of them said null results have no publication potential, even if they themselves found it personally interesting. Others say that they just deprioritized it. They had other things that were showing good results, and so they just fell off their priority list. Others say that eventually, I think this is actually the most problematic one, where it suggested that they went out and find other samples that confirmed the hypotheses, and I think this is extremely dangerous. I kind of did an informal study here at VIS, where I just stood out in the hallway and asked this question. Have you had a paper that was rejected due to null results? And it was very interesting to see some of the insights from our colleagues here. And the people who I approached are people who are well established in our communities, have published tons of papers, and so I was actually surprised by some of their feedback that I got. One of the things that I realized from a lot of people is that null results triggered self-doubt. Some of the researchers didn't even try to publish them. One person said, I don't submit them because I'm unsure whether it was due to issues with the experiment design or if there was truly nothing there to find. Others expressed difficulty in writing these papers. Someone said, I feel pressure to spin it, especially in grad school. We try to find something instead of reporting that we just didn't find anything. Another person recalled, I can think of one paper that got rejected, but I'm not sure if it was because of the null results. It was rejected from VIS, then I submitted it to TBCG, I got a major review and then a minor review, and it was eventually accepted, but in the end, they had to write a longer than usual discussion to address why they believed these findings were meaningful. People thought that reviewers lacked guidelines for how to evaluate these null results. One person said, if I have null results, I don't submit them because I assume people don't know how to review them. Someone else said, one reviewer went out of their way to say, I'm not rejecting this because of null results, but the fact that they needed to point this out suggested that they recognize that this is an issue. So I've been on both sides of this, where I'm the researcher submitting papers, and it's a really dim, dark, depleted house. But if you open up the curtains, it's actually not even pretty outside. And so some of the things that I can't really say because the review process is confidential, but I can tell you at least this year, I was extremely frustrated because there are some areas where I know I'm an expert in, and I know I'm just one of the few people who can really have an expert opinion on this specific topic. And there was this specific paper that I was invited as a reviewer. I was the only person that rated myself as an expert. And this paper had null results are a very small effect, but I thought that it was important for both those of us in the area to at least know that this is not a road worth pursuing. And it never got accepted. Even though I was the only expert on that paper, my opinion was overridden by the primary reviewer and all the external reviewers. And so that was extremely frustrating. So what do I suggest? First, authors, you need to write up your results. At a minimum, publish a preprint somewhere so that others can have access to it. Paper shares and steering committees, at least from my N of one situation, I feel like this was partially based on the fact that the primary reviewer wasn't a good fit for this paper. So the primary reviewer wasn't an expert in this area, so they couldn't really evaluate their contribution either. And primary reviewers, I don't think they did a good job at selecting the other external reviewers, and I feel like the people who were reviewing this paper just didn't have the expertise to do it. And so this is just one example, but I've had many examples where I've reviewed papers and I just never see them at all because they all got rejected for this specific reason. And so I want to end by just saying that I believe that it is just as important to mark known dead ends and dangerous spots as blazing paths that people can safely travel. And that statement was inspired by Jordan, but we really just need to be better.
Thank you very much. I like that, by the way, because we talk about null results all the time because we get so many. And next is Melany, Tory, an in-person presentation.
All right, thank you. So my fellow panelists have presented all kinds of different interesting topics around reviews, and I want to take a slightly different angle and talk about diversity in viz papers. First, I'd like to acknowledge a few people because most of the opinions I'm going to present today have been heavily influenced by discussions with Sheila, Justin, and Tatiana. And I want to point you to an article that we have coming out about embracing disciplinary diversity in viz in next month's CGNA. All right, so the kind of diversity that I want to talk about today is intellectual and disciplinary diversity. In other words, different methodologies, people coming from different disciplinary backgrounds, different kinds of research that might enrich the viz community if we're presenting more of it here. And so I'd like to ask the question, what can we do to kind of widen the pool of contributions that we're getting to the Viz conference? And this is not the first time that we've heard about diversity this week. Yesterday, we heard Ali Sargad sharing some data on past Viz publications where he told us that we're actually not doing a very good job at encouraging disciplinary diversity in the Viz conference. And also yesterday, Mariah Meyer presented the perspective that if we want to be a diverse community, we need to embrace a diverse set of values to make that happen. So some of the questions that were posed as we were organizing this panel were things like, should Viz be restricting itself to specific contribution types or paper types? Maybe should user study papers require an ethics approval from an IRB board or pre-registration? And should we have strict expertise requirements for reviewers? And I'm going to give you my simple answer to this question, and it's no. So let me explain. And to do that, I'm going to use an analogy of choosing a pet. So bear with me, I promise this will be relevant. All right, this dog is a Labrador. We have some pretty clear, established rules we could use to decide whether a dog is a Labrador. It's got a big, thick tail, it's got some floppy ears, and it's got a happy-go-lucky personality, and if we really wanted to, we could do a DNA test and prove that a dog is a Lab. This is a different kind of dog. This is a poodle. Poodle has different characteristics. It's hypoallergenic because it has hair, but it's a little bit high-strung. Now, more recently in the dog breed world, some folks decided to create the Labradoodle. The Labradoodle is created by breeding a poodle and a lab, so it's a mix of the two. And the reason it's become such a very popular pet in our world is because it brings together the happy-go-lucky nature of the lab with the hypoallergenic hair of a poodle. Now this dog is a mutt. We don't know what breeds made up this dog. However, this dog might make a very good pet. So we could define for ourselves some cross-cutting properties of what makes a great pet. Maybe it's friendly, and it's trainable, and it's healthy, and we could go on. Okay, so I'm paper is not so different from choosing a pen. First off, if we go to the pound to look for our pet and we're only looking for labs or poodles, we might miss out on some other great pets, like the mixture that turned into the labradoodle, or the mutt, who might also be friendly and fun and a good friend. So this is sort of analogous to an over-reliance on paper types, where we try to box ourselves in and think about, does it fit this type or that type? More broadly, establishing sort of rigid types and rules might make authors and papers that don't quite fit the mold perhaps feel a little less welcome at the conference and less likely to submit in the first place. So more broadly than that, in pursuit of great science, we tend to create in this community some rules and guidelines that have good intention, but inadvertently might start to erect some barriers to intellectual diversity. So we create these guidelines, but we kind of fence ourselves in with them. So for example, let's look at rigid requirements for viz submissions. If we require things like pre-registration for empirical studies or strictly define empirical study protocols, we might start to miss out on some kinds of research, perhaps the more qualitative studies from certain kinds of epistemological perspectives, where things like strict protocols and pre-registration might be sort of antithetical to the goals of the research. Similarly, if we were to require human research ethics approval, we might miss out on organizations that don't have human research ethics boards, like industry research or small nonprofits. So that's not to say that things like pre-registration and open science and human research ethics approval aren't important. They're great assets to our community, but let's just not make them rigid requirements. Okay, so what can we do? So to be inclusive, I would encourage you as reviewers to start to embrace and celebrate approaches in papers that you review that might be unfamiliar to you or might be unusual in the viz community, because those could be perfectly valid and interesting and enriching perspectives to bring to our community. I'd also encourage you to treat paper types and guidelines as examples. They're good examples that can be useful, perhaps for training new researchers as the different ways they could construct their research, but they are only examples in a broader sea of possibilities. And finally, as you're reviewing a paper, focus on whether it brings something of value to our community. In other words, is this guy a good pen? Thanks.
Thank you to the panelists for all these great presentations. And now we're going to open up the discussion to the audience for audience questions. I guess the questions are going to come via Slido, but if somebody wants to also ask a question in person, that's fine. I just have to remember to repeat the question in the microphone, I think. So I will look at the Slido for questions starting. So the first question is for Cody. Cody, can you hear us?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. It says, replicability is not often a criterion in qualitative research, so quantitative research would not get the badge. How might your open science review approach accept research studies based on, for example, constructivist frameworks or other ontologies and epistemologies using qualitative methods? I hope you could understand that question.
So unfortunately, both the people who have been actively working on the Open Practices Committee this year are positivists. And so we would love any input you guys can give us on how we can best incorporate all of these other aspects of viz research. We did have a panel yesterday where we talked through these things, and as part of that, Melany, Tory here, gave an excellent little quote. She said, in many qualitative methodologies, the vehicle to transparency is through the writing of the paper itself, where we build credibility through the notion of thick descriptions, providing enough detail, quotes, examples, vignettes, reflections, that the reader can make up their own mind of whether or not to trust authors' conclusions from the work. And so my initial thoughts are, what guidance can we give reviewers that would let them gauge whether there is enough of this description beyond the initial sense that they get from reading the paper and doing the review? You know, how can we try to codify that a little bit into guidelines? Now, Mariah Meyer and Jason Dykes wrote a paper specifically about design studies, about criteria for rigor and visualization design studies, where they listed a bunch of aspects of transparency, and at least for that aspect of qualitative research, those seem like a good starting point. But again, please talk to me, fill out the survey, tell me what I'm missing, so we can try to shape this together.
Thank you very much. We have more questions coming in, so this one's from Mariah herself, actually. It doesn't look like it's addressed to a specific panelist. So it says, a challenge with design studies can be that we spend a lot of time designing and developing a tool, and then sometimes there isn't anything that novel or interesting coming out. What would an embrace of the null result for design study look like, and what is important about acknowledging these? That's a good one. Maybe Alvitta, you have some thoughts on that one?
I mean, so I don't. So you're talking about specifically design studies, and I really honestly don't see a difference here. Especially my brilliant, and if you choose to design a study, it's because you expect something to be there. You have some sort of hypotheses, and I believe though that even finding nothing there is important. One of the things that we tend to do in our community is we tend to overgeneralize our results. You finding nothing means that you found nothing on your specific scenarios, with your specific experiment design. That doesn't necessarily mean if someone goes out and repeats it using a different set of users, that they will also find nothing. And I do feel though that maybe it's like us being too nice, and maybe it's the same, very similar to us not going out and replicating studies, because I do believe that that is still an important finding, and if someone goes out and tries to replicate it and find that, oh, I find something here, being able to reason about what are the differences in these experiments, what are the differences in the experiment protocol, that is going to still be helpful for future research. So I just feel like we just need to be a little bit more open and transparent, even when we don't find anything, because I just feel like there might be a lot of us just doing the same things over and over again, and we can't learn from each other's findings, we can't learn from each other's mistakes. And as a small community, we need that transparency and openness in order to grow.
Yeah, that's really great. I know that I've also spent years on some projects and then had no results, and I just think it's such a pity that I can't share this, because I could save another researcher some years worth of time and effort if they could already see this project being attempted. Okay, we have more questions on Slido. So here's one from TJ. Can others speak to specific types of works excluded from our current area models paper types? I know Viz Ed papers are, quote, nowhere in those guidelines. Anybody want to make a comment on that? I was thinking about that when Melany was speaking, actually. I thought we could have another paper type called other, you know, that doesn't fit into the, because I know I've had papers rejected for not fitting in exactly in one of those categories.
Yeah, I actually have a fairly strong opinion on the idea of an other category. So part of the problem is that our areas capture what has historically been submitted to us, right? And that's a good way to divide up papers to reviewers, but it does classify things, and it makes it perhaps less comfortable for people who don't, or papers that don't fit into those categories, to feel welcome. And an other category might similarly feel less welcome because it's sort of like othering someone. And so I'd rather that we express paper types, if we have to have them, as kind of examples in the broader space of what we could have, and encourage papers that cross boundaries and that fit into VIS as we know it, but maybe not a given category.
This is also another opportunity to email David, since he will be chairing the area curation committee. But I think that yes, you know, these areas were created with a retrospective analysis, but I do think it's worthwhile to think, you know, what should areas be in the future? How can we encourage this kind of intellectual diversity?
Nice, okay. We have one from Petra to Torston. So Torston, your stats on NURIPS seem to imply that rejected papers were resubmitted unchanged rather than improved based on the reviews received. Was this investigated?
So if my stats imply that, that's bad, because that's absolutely not the case. The paper goes, the reporting of this process goes quite into detail about how they were trying to find these rejected papers, that the times have changed, some authors have changed, and all the fun stuff that wasn't trivial whatsoever. And so, yeah, yes, the papers definitely have changed. That was one of my motivations to really think and to emphasize, and maybe I didn't make that strong enough, this shepherding process. I think it's worthwhile to think about accepting more papers, but having a more thorough shepherding process. So I think something can become an overflow. It needs some thought.
Okay, great. So we have one from Tobias for Alex. You argue for reviewer anonymity, but also for publishing the reviews themselves. Don't you think that both goals conflict with each other because of the potential for a de-anonymization of the reviewers with a growing body of reviews and a relatively small community size?
Well, so what? I'm not super concerned about this, right? Like for example, if you're ever a paper chair or a primary, you also read a lot of reviews, right? And I'm not completely sure, like I think this is, you know, in some weird cases, maybe if somebody is not careful, they could be de-anonymized, but I don't actually, you know, like it's hard to tell who wrote a paper. It's even harder to tell who wrote a review, I think, because there's less of a signature style there. So, you know, in theory it could be a problem, but I think we have to weigh the costs versus the benefits, and you know, this is a very theoretical problem. I'm not completely convinced it's real, and the benefits of publishing reviews are actually real.
I was also thinking about the number of reviews written every year. I mean, there are like 10,000 reviews written every year, so it's quite a jungle out there. Okay, I had another good question here. This one, scroll, unfortunately. Okay, here it is. It's from Melany. I love the dog analogy. Question about the ethics. Do you think we should instead influence the industry to follow stricter ethical standards? If we do not require ethical aspects such as an IRB and pre-registration, then would that not inject a risk of unethical studies in academia?
So to be clear, I'm not encouraging us to, ditch ethics. Ethics are critical in our research, especially in human research. And we absolutely need to adhere to strict ethical standards. The problem is that just not every organization has a formal ethics review board, and we can't force or encourage those organizations to do that. If you take a big company, instituting an ethics review board is not kind of part of their mandate. They're unlikely to do it just because we say we need it. We're more likely to just lose out on papers coming from that organization, and that would be a little sad. So absolutely, we need to find ways to make sure our research adheres to ethics. We just shouldn't do it by imposing a strict requirement that it has undergone some ethics review board.
Maybe I can add something to that. I fully agree, and actually, whole countries don't have IRBs or processes. Like when I was a student in Austria, I never had to do an IRB for anything, right? That was just not a thing. And so really the only thing that we can do is to do this at the conference level, at the publication level, right? Because then we have standards for everybody. And I don't think it should be strict in any sense, right? We should leave this up to the authors to discuss this.
Oh, Cody, do you want to say something?
Sure. Actually, following up on that point and one of the previous ones mentioned, one way that we could potentially involve ethics review as part of the review process, early enough in the process to help authors before they actually run the study, is by adding the type of paper that we've never really seen much at VIS, which is registered reports. Now, that's when you say, this is your study design, before you go and collect the data, and the reviewers review it, and critique it, and have you adjust it, and then say, okay, if you do this, we will publish your results, whatever they are. That gets you no results presented. But for somebody at an institution or in a country where they don't have an IRB they can ask, we could use the reviewers in that process as ethics review to do the kinds of things an IRB board normally would.
It's an interesting idea.
So, I want to ask the panel a question, because I feel like what I'm hearing a lot is like the reviewer can be an ethics reviewer, the reviewer can review the data, the reviewer can review, like, what are we asking of reviewers?
We're also asking it of the authors, right?
We're good at creating more work for ourselves, that's for sure.
Yeah, it does seem like an awful lot, and I'm a little nervous if we're sort of judging papers after the fact on some of these criteria and leaving it up to a review process to decide. Makes me a little nervous.
No, the benefit though of just asking people to write about ethics is that they will think about it themselves, right? And they will, have that thought in their mind when they design their study. They might be thinking about how do I present this, what are the choices that I need to make. And so I think just the act of going through the process and asking yourself these questions that Casey had lined out, I think is very valuable. And whether we catch it later and review that somebody validated this and say, no, you may not publish this paper because you have not followed this one thing is less important to me than an author engaging with it.
Okay, there are some more questions on Slido, but I guess in the recognizing that we're a little bit over time and in the interest of keeping with the schedule and going to get the coffee break and everything, I think we should wrap up now. Let's thank our panelists again. And I hope we can keep this discussion going during the coffee break.